Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorten, and I'm here as always with Paul. And Paul, what a week it's been. Putin and Trump have gotten together with a long phone call, and a lot of things regarding NATO, Ukraine, and the like seem to be accelerating towards an end. Of course, we have also some commentary from Secretary of Defense Hegseth, which I think is vastly important. And for that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to you. And welcome to the show, Paul.
Yes, and thanks for joining, Ken. Always a pleasure when we get together. So, yeah, there was kind of obviously an inevitability at some point. Putin and Trump would talk, and in the last week or two, the Russians have been downplaying this, suggesting not a lot's being discussed, even though there has been quite a lot of back channel activity. Clearly, they wanted to keep a lid on it as much as possible, and no doubt because at some point we'll talk about the reaction of NATO and Europe and, of course, the Ukrainians. But it was bound to happen. And the whole basis of this discussion, and we'll get into some of the detail, is really, and we always knew this would be the case, Ukraine would not be party to any discussions. How the war ends, and you can call it negotiations or however else you want to phrase it, would be between both the United States and Russia and no one else, including, of course, the United Kingdom, who no doubt's probably pretty miffed about the fact that this has happened. But I think we should start discussing a little bit about when Hegseth, who's the new US Secretary of Defense, came out and made some points about Ukraine and the war. And for me, it was very telling because, apart from making the obvious statements, the war needs to end, which anyone sound of mind would agree, he just came out very bluntly. And this is something which we mentioned together, Ken, before we came on air, is there is continuity of opinion in or statements coming out of the Trump administration. They're being very, very straightforward, very clear about this. And again, we'd say we'll praise them when it's worth praising, and we'll criticize them when it's worth criticizing. But I would say, I think for Trump, a lot of this is Trump's more interested in ending the war from a US perspective. Okay, the knock-on effect is it ends the war between the two countries, which, of course, has to end. But it would be hugely beneficial for the United States for the war to end. And quite simply, for the following reasons. Look, we know the Trump administration was never responsible for the US response to the Ukraine war starting nearly 3 years ago. But as is always the case with the United States, when they're in an awkward situation, when they've been privy to creating a proxy war or some similar action, and it goes south, goes horribly wrong, they want a quick exit. They want a way out and they want to pretend they were never there. And for Trump, he's only just become president, so it's an ideal time for him to draw a line under this, end it, stop the enormous hemorrhaging of money that the US has pumped in, which the Biden administration had no problem. And Trump's going, I have a serious problem with this. I want to know where money was spent, by who, when. And they just want to curtail this. They don't want any more military aid as much, and they still will provide it to some degree, but they're putting the onus on Europe to do this. And basically, this is a way we've got to find a way out. Let's have an exit strategy. And then we can move on and pretend we were never here. And it's rather like spending 20 plus years in Afghanistan and then suddenly deciding in the blink of an eye we're leaving, and they just went. And the United States really hardly talks about Afghanistan. Anyone likes to pretend it never went there, and it thinks, well, it'll be yesterday's news rather rapidly, and people move on, because this is what will happen with Ukraine. The Ukrainians will never forget it for obvious reasons. The Russians won't. But sadly, most people in the rest of the world, it'll become yesterday's news, and very quickly they'll move on to something else, because that's what people do. So I think that's the initial point worth making. And for the US's perspective, they want repayment for the hundreds of billions of dollars they've invested. And Trump's already saying, I want rare earth metals. Okay, it's a bit of a bone of contention because the problem is Russia controls huge swathes of the land, or now it is Russian territory as far as Russia's concerned. And the US seems like it's not going to demand in any way, shape, or form Russia gives that land up. So on that basis, where are they going to get these rare earth metals from? There is one point worth making about this, and that is the fact that Russia is on the verge of taking Pokrovsk, and if they take that, then they'll rapidly move into Dnipro. That's the region. And there won't be much defense there, so Russia could take that very rapidly. And here's the thing. I mean, okay, bear in mind, I think all these figures are hugely inflated, but there's claims of $3.5 trillion equivalent worth of resources in Dnipro. So if Russia takes it quickly and says, we'll have a referendum, this is part of Russia, then the United States is going to miss out. So because that basically, if you tie that in with Lugansk and Donetsk, that's pretty much the vast bulk of natural resources that the US is interested in. So Trump is motivated by, and it'll make Trump look good, of course. It'll make his administration look good if they can help end the war. But also, if he wants resources back, he doesn't want the land that the resources are on to be already taken by Russia, and that could happen very rapidly. So this is why I think there's a bit of this push by the Americans to make this happen, shall we say, quicker than we would have expected ordinarily.
Yeah, and from another side point, we saw last week where Zelensky is just pretty much throwing everything he can at the window. Hopefully something will stick. In essence, he made the proposal that, well, we could do a land trade, what we have remaining in Kursk, give it back to the Russians, and then they give us the land, which allegedly was going to contain many of the mines and current mines and potential of minerals, rare earths, etc., in an attempt to go ahead and appease and get Trump to give more arms, give more aid, and to potentially bring the conflict to an end. That, of course, was just pie in the sky. But now, since we know, and we've talked about this in the past, Trump's eye is never been on Russia. It's always been on China. That's been the adversary. It's a trade war. And of course, Trump's really business is business. So if the best thing to do in this case, and this is just as a thought, is this meeting, this phone call, hour-and-a-half phone call that both sides said went really well, that if Trump can reestablish good relations, because before the conflict started under the Biden administration, the U.S. was purchasing Russian oil, a lot of it at cheap prices. And of course, Europe was getting cheap energy. So I suspect Russia would be probably content if they got some assurances to then allow or facilitate the selling of minerals, rare earths, etc., in the Ukrainian regions that they control, which would be under the Russian Federation, sell that to the United States. They wouldn't have to rely upon China, and then they could focus on China. Because you said something in the past about BRICS, is that each nation is not going to be held to having to appease other BRICS nations if they want to make agreements with somebody who might be an adversary and the like. So there's a potential of this, especially if the United States can rein in or simply, start leaving NATO. European, maybe close some bases, stop the funding that has allowed a lot of these NGOs or whomever to go ahead and create the chaos in some of the Balkan states. There's just a lot of potential in this, and especially what's two of the big things that would appease Russia: reconnect them to SWIFT and free their frozen assets. You start doing that and give assurances that the U.S. is going to at least keep some pressure on the what remains of Ukraine, and if Zelensky eventually gets ousted by some elections, then Russia is going to at least have some assurances and feel much safer, and see the potential of a partnership going forward versus the proxy war adversary system that's been going on in between the two Trump administrations.
Yeah, it's very true, absolutely, and that's an important consideration. But I think what we should start off before we get into Trump and Putin's discussion was there was a short clip that was doing the rounds, which had Hegseth, who's the US Defense Secretary, and he made some very pointed statements, which immediately, of course, got made Europe very angry, and we'll talk about Europe separately because that's a separate issue. We'll talk about Ukraine's response to this separately. Let's just focus on what the US is saying first off. Now, he came out and said, apart from the war has to end, that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders was an unrealistic goal, and if you pursue this idea that that's going to happen, you're just going to only increase suffering, meaning huge more casualties, which is absolutely true. Also, he basically said, look, the United States doesn't think Ukraine's membership in NATO is a realistic outcome of these negotiations, meaning it's not going to happen. Now, that's a real bone of contention, because you can say that today, but is that going to be a concrete proposal that lasts ad infinitum? Because there might be elements of the United States who go, well, in 4 years, Trump's gone. In 4 or 5 years, maybe Putin's gone. Maybe we can revisit that at some point in time, but let's not get bogged down in how long could this last for. The other point he made, and I think this is, well, 2 points which are absolutely critical. He said the United States will never put troops in Ukraine. US military presence is not going to be part of any security guarantees. That is a huge statement, because that basically says we're washing our hands of Ukraine. We don't want anything to do with it. And if we're not there, to all intents and purposes, NATO is not going to get involved in Ukraine going forward. And what also sort of backs that viewpoint up is he said, if there are peacekeepers in Ukraine in the future, bear in mind they're not going to be a US one, it will not be under the auspices of NATO and not in accordance with Article 5 of the Charter. So Europe can sit there screaming and howling about the fact there needs to be peacekeepers because they're terrified Russia's going to come after them in 5 weeks' time or 5 years' time. America's going, it's not happening. You can send whoever you like, but if you start getting tangled up in a war with the Russians in the future, you're on your own, Europe. So don't get us involved. So that was, I think, an extremely telling point to make to the Europeans. Okay, there's still this ongoing thing where, with regards to NATO itself, if you don't stump up 5% of GDP, then maybe we'll end it. I mean, and by the way, the US says we've got our own problems to deal with on our own border. We're going to focus on that. Well, so it's down to you if you seriously want to protect Europe. And I think also what was very telling was when he said our transatlantic relationship requires European allies to take responsibility for security on the continent. You've never heard a US defense secretary or administration ever say that. That's basically going, we're not interested anymore in actually taking responsibility for your defense. You're responsible for it, and you'll have to pay huge sums more money to defend yourself, and it's down to you. We're not getting involved. I mean, we have to be careful exactly how we interpret that. But the argument could be is that might be seen in some quarters as the United States saying, we've had enough of having Russia as an adversary. We're not going to regard them as an adversary anymore in that sense. And this is the end of the Cold War. I mean, I'm not saying it is the case. And the argument is, look, Europe, if you have a problem with Russia, that's down to you. You're going to take responsibility. We're not getting involved anymore. Because here's the point. The whole point for the US and NATO's very existence was to say, well, we have to protect you, Europe, from Russia. Now they're basically saying, you protect yourself. We're not getting involved. We've got our own problems to deal with. Get on with it. It's not our problem anymore. And by the way, with Ukraine, forget NATO, forget Article 5. In fact, forget any US presence whatsoever. It's nothing to do with if they follow through in those actions. That's monumental. That's a huge shift in US policy decisions, the US way of thinking. And, if you look at Hegseth's statements overall, basically he's going, well, everybody in the world knows that NATO is the United States. The idea of the future of NATO is now questionable. Europe, pay up or forget it. It's not happening. The US is certainly washing its hands of Ukraine by going, there's no NATO responsibility. Because if there's no NATO responsibility in the future, be it membership, be it peacekeepers, be it Article 5 or anything else, then that's a huge shift in policy. And Europe, you're going to foot the bills, and Europe sat there, and we'll talk about Europe separately another time. They're sat there going, well, hang on, what's the future of NATO? What are we supposed to do? And of course, then there's the whole issue of what does Ukraine make of this? Because effectively, the decisions that the United States is talking about is we're not interested in what Ukraine has to say on this matter. We're not interested in what our NATO partners have to say on this matter. We're making unilateral decisions. We're going to sit there with the Russians and go, that's how it's going to be. And we'll reach an agreement, and the rest of you will just have to suck it up and accept it. And as I say, in a future discussion, we'll talk about the European response, because we want to keep some chronology in how we're discussing this. But for me, I think, Ken, that's probably a good point to stop with the first one. In this, I'm not going to call it a series because it seems to have caused some abject confusion when we call them parts 1 and 2. But I think this sets the scene for what then subsequently was discussed between Trump and Putin, and then we can analyze that conversation as much as we understand what that conversation was, and then take it from there.
Absolutely. We got a number of different topics we can do to regarding this, what has taken place in the last week. So it's a good point to stop. Paul, as always, thank you for your insight and for being a part of this great discussion.
Yes, and likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you for all of your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.